Hello and welcome. My name's Marek Bidwell and this talk is called A Northumbrian Odyssey, and it's a pleasure to be giving a talk for the Natural History Society. I've been a member for many years, ever since I moved to Newcastle from Nottingham in 1993 and came here to study marine biology. I have a particular affinity for the nature reserve in Gosforth, just up the road. It's like the sort of green lungs of Newcastle to me, and it's where I often go to escape and relax and observe the wildlife. So this talk is basically about a long walk around Northumberland. Although I've lived here for many years and I'm very familiar with perhaps some of the more popular spots to visit up the coast and in the hills, I've never really joined it together coherently in my head. And I took it upon myself in 2019 to walk up the coast, and then that developed into completing a circuit more or less of the county of Northumberland, straying into Cumbria a bit in places as well. And the basic premise of this talk is a question. If you walked 260 miles around the Northumberland in the summer, without straying too far from the path, what wildlife would you hope to see? Of course, some of you will be expert entomologists or ornithologists, and you would all observe different things. Let's couch this in the terms of an enthusiastic amateur like myself. So this talk described the route, the landscape, and then the different types of wildlife I saw. Also, I linked to some other Natural History Society talks that I've enjoyed recently. The warning is I'm an enthusiastic amateur, and this talk is episodic. It's not meant to be a survey of the wildlife in Northumberland. But if you are unfamiliar with the wildlife, and maybe a good introduction, hints of where to go. If you're familiar, you'll probably be shouting at the screen going, why didn't Marek look behind him? He'd have seen something wonderful. Anyway, you can tell me about that, perhaps over Twitter or the next time we meet in person. I'm still learning. I think that's the important thing to point out. So the walk started and ended in Blyth. In 2019, I walked up the coast. In 2020, I walked from Bamborough to Wooler, down the Cheviots, Redesdale to Haltwhistle. And then earlier this year in the summer, I completed the circuit back to Blyth via Crossfell in Cumbria and the Derwent Valley, that wonderful river valley on the border between Northumberland and County Durham. But although this talk is about a walk, it starts with two people of my wife and I, Dorothy and Mary Pearson, who lived in Heaton for many years. And they were sisters. And they took us under their wing when we first moved to Newcastle. And sadly, Mary passed away in 2016. And then in 2019, Dorothy became much iller and we were looking after her. And then a friend came to visit and stay with her in the summer for about a month, and that gave me the chance to have a break. I didn't want to go far in case her condition deteriorated, so I packed a bag, scavenged a few items from the loft, borrowed a bivvy bag from a friend, and walked up, caught the bus to Blyth and walked up the coast. You'll see Dorothy on the left there. She had a real love of flowers. She lived for 10 years of her life in Kenya. She was also a biology teacher in Alnwick and in Newcastle. And I shared many stories and visits with her to places in Northumberland like Howick Hall, where we enjoyed exploring the gardens. And she really shared with me and Tracy her love of knowledge of wildflowers in Northumberland in particular. She was actually, both of them were evacuated in the war to Ingram in the Breamish Valley. And it was there, I remember Dorothy telling me, she first discovered her love of wildflowers walking on the, along the banks of the river, discovering mimulus and forget-me-nots, which she was always very fond of. So, part one, the coast. This is the route in a bit more detail there. You can also see where I slept with the little campsites up to Bamborough and Sea houses. You'll see that the route up the coast crosses the River Blyth, the Wansbeck, the Coquet and the Alm on my travels. So I got off the bus in Blyth, and this was quite a visual starting point to my walk at Blyth Staithes, the former coal staithes where coal from the area was unloaded from wagons and onto ships and went all around the world. And this sculpture marries, if you like, the old industrial past of the area. The panels at the top depict coal wagons, and then the sinuous metal tentacles perhaps depict wind turbines or future aspirations of the area. I headed north up to the estuary. There was a stiff breeze that day, but it was very warm. And some of you may remember that 2019 was a bumper year for red admirals, and all the flowers in this area were covered in those butterflies, and they followed me really on my journey up north and were a feature of the walk. Just inland a little way, I saw the first really good wildlife sighting of my walk, which is a whole family of shelduck. I've seen adult shelduck before, but never seen 10 of them in a group. And the juvenile shelducks were really cute, and tails were waggling, and then the parents would go underwater and all the babies would follow them, and then they'd pop up and in a sort of explosion, a bill waggling frenzy. So I walked up the Blythe, across the road bridge, and then back to the coast and got to Camas, where there's this long pipe that extends down to sea, and at the end of the pipe there was another family, and in this case it was eider ducks. There were several families, because there were 44 eider ducks that I counted bobbing around at the end of the pipe. And many of you will know that eider ducks are a bit like the county bird of Northumberland, because they're known as the cuddy duck, named after St Cuthbert, who possibly passed one of the first environmental laws and supposedly protected them, gave them protection on the Farne Islands. Just next to the pipe was a sign, and on top of the sign was a meadow pipit, and the sign read "Steelwork exposed at low tide." The meadow pipit was looking longingly up to the church at New Biggin, just up the coast. A little bit further north, I got to the Wansbeck, and I've often seen this view from the A189 as I drive north. I've often thought it looked like a very tempting little harbour to go for a visit in, but I never actually walked round there. And it is really beautiful. There's gorse all the way along the north shore. And I disturbed a sparrowhawk that was, I think it just caught a mouse, and it had it in its talons. And it sort of gave me a really wry look as I disturbed it, and it flew off. I stopped there for a little swim and swam across the estuary and around those little boats. And then before I left, I picked up a bag of, cleared the sand of all the rubbish that had possibly been left by, well, I don't know who by, but I put it in a bin at the caravan site just to the north. So then I passed New Biggin and the infamous statue of the couple out to sea in the harbour there. And on my first evening, I got to Lynemouth Power Station, a really romantic spot to spend my first night out in the wild. But it was illuminated by the setting sun, which transformed it into a radiant silhouette that looked a bit like a dragon's lair, and all of the bits of plastic or coal on the beach were shining like emeralds and diamonds and onyx. So there I was, lying in my bivvy bag, and I suddenly discovered that I had really bad backache. It's a long time since I last went camping, when I did my Duke of Edinburgh at school, and it seemed like the ground had got lower or my back had got weaker. Anyway, I persevered and took some painkillers, and then I shoved tissue paper in my ears so that I could sleep because of the noise coming from the power station. But I was rewarded in the morning with a beautiful dawn sunrise over the North Sea, probably at about 5 o'clock in the morning, and a ribbon of cloud hung on the horizon, a half-imagined archipelago, and it reminded me of one of my favourite books, The Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula Le Guin. The morning light illuminated the wildflowers on the dunes there, and I got my first sight of the bloody Cranesbill, the county flower of Northumberland, that shouted out from the marram grass with its bright magenta petals. And then another flower that was also very bright, of acid yellow, wild mignonette. I looked it up in my flower book, perhaps, and it says rough grassy places, dunes, waste ground and alkaline soils, and I wondered maybe if it grows here because the ground conditions have been altered by the industry in the area. So that morning I walked up mile upon mile of Drurage Bay, dunes to the left, the sea to the right, and sand underfoot. Quite a meditative experience on your own when you don't have an agenda or time scale. And I began to relax into the walk until I spotted a fizzing out to sea, gannets plunging into the water. And then I saw a tail, possibly a leap, and it was dolphins. Now, this is an amazing sight to me because I studied marine biology at the Dove Marine Laboratory in Cullercoats 25 years ago. And I spent a whole year down there and never saw a dolphin. And it's only comparatively recently that I and probably other people have started seeing them off the Northumberland coast. So I ran down to the beach and followed them with my tiny compact binoculars until they disappeared into the bright sun. Some of you may remember an excellent talk given by Martin from Northern Experience Wildlife Tours a few years ago for the Society. And he told us that this family of dolphins that we now see regularly off the Northumberland coast, these bottlenose dolphins, is a breakaway group from a family up on the east coast of Scotland. And they even know the names of individuals and can identify them. And he mentioned one called Runny Paint that defected from the Moray Firth in 2001. And one of the things I love about being in the Natural History Society is, you know, gradually over the years, putting the pieces of the jigsaw of the wildlife in the area together through the talks and the knowledge of members and from my own sightings. So eventually I tore myself away from the dolphins as they disappeared and got to the next landmark up the coast, Coca Island. I've never visited, it's a private reserve, but I could see through my binoculars the fizz of terns and gulls zipping around that island. And there was another talk more recently that you can watch on the YouTube channel of the Society by Christopher Redfern and Ibrahim Al-Fawi, who study and protect the roseate terns that nest there. So the next place I got to was Walkworth. And I walked around the back of the castle into the River Coquet there. And that's actually the only place I saw a kingfisher on my 260-mile trip. And then I came round following the path north, and I was absolutely stunned into submission by this view of the poppies growing up between the crops. And it reminded me of that sculpture some of you may have seen a few years ago called Blood-Swept Lands and Seas of Red, a memorial to soldiers in the war. And it looked like a sort of landscape version of that poppy sculpture. And as an added bonus, the farmland was inhabited by a family of grey partridge. Second night, I slept in the dunes just north of Walkworth, and I put this slide up because from a wildlife perspective, I was inundated with midges, which wasn't something I expected. It was like being up in Scotland. They were in my ears and in my food and in my hair. Fortunately, I did have a mosquito net with me. I donned that and managed to keep the worst of them away. But to me, that's a sign of healthy wildlife, a healthy ecosystem. Got lots of bugs for the birds to eat and the bats. The following morning, I walked up the coast until I got to Alnmouth. It was low tide, and I was quite fortunate. I was able to wade across. I'm not going to talk about the birds of Alnmouth much because you can look up another talk on the Society's website by Tom, who gave us a fantastic detailed dive into his patch. I'd thoroughly recommend that one to you. But here's me dehydrated, dishevelled, banging headache, crossing the Aln, wading through, and then I dived into a cafe for a long second breakfast and was somewhat restored in Alnmouth there, and drunk several litres of water before moving on up this rather lovely path to Foxton Hall. At the top of that path, I stopped and was silent and listened. And I heard a buzz and chirp. And I think that the grass was full of insects, crickets possibly. I really felt enveloped by nature at that point. And it was a bit like being on a safari in Africa where you get all those exotic sounds and buzzes. I feel quite envious of Tom that this is his local patch. And I've returned to that point since to sort of relive that wonderful experience. A little bit further north, I got to Bulmer, where perhaps, rather modestly say, took perhaps the best photograph of my trip, because a stone chap perched a couple of feet in front of me on a thistle, and its inky black eye had a bright white collar, rufous belly and a flicking tail. It really looked trim and dandy, in the words of Norman McCaig. A marvellous bird. And then descended down into Howick Haven, a place where the wood meets the sea, two worlds meet. It's one of the few places that I've been where you can be in a thick, dense, deciduous wood and you can hear the sound of seagulls flying around just out to sea at the same time. Here there were a few waders, oyster catchers and redshanks, and also a sandpiper ferreting around in the burn there looking for food. And this reminded me of Dorothy, of course, because we visited Howick Garden with her once, and I remember her admiring the daffodils and so on. That evening I ate my supper on the cliffs at Cullenose Point, had a panoramic view up to Dunfell Castle, out to the sea, and I had a soundtrack of hundreds of kittiwakes calling from the cliffs. I had Dunfell Castle all to myself the next morning, probably at about 6 AM, after passing through Craster, and paused to admire the dramatic poster boy of the Northumberland coastline. But what really caught my attention was just around the back, these cliffs that I didn't know existed, and I didn't know was a wonderful seabird colony. A frenzy of birds were launching from the cliffs, and they formed a cat's cradle of crisscrossing flight paths. The sea fizzed as they dived, and then they surfaced like corks. And I got out my little binoculars and saw there were guillemots, razorbills, and then I looked for a bit longer and saw a solitary puffin. So that was quite a good bird for my part one of my walk. Here's a photograph looking back towards Dunstable Castle from Embleton Bay on that lovely sunny day. And then just a bit further north, I came across a lovely wildflower meadow, a huge area, really, full of more bloody cranesbill and possibly lady's bedstraw, poppies and all sorts of flowers I can see there. And also had these little common blue butterflies in, and probably more red admirals. And that's an area that I want to return to one summer. Probably one of the best flower meadows I've seen. A little bit further up, I got to Newton Haven. I didn't go for a swim here, but this is one of my favourite places to go snorkeling in Northumberland. So I just mentioned that the bay is really good for marine wildlife, hermit crabs and periwinkles, top shells, dog whelks. And I remember once snorkeling here when I saw a peacock worm with all its fronds out, and then it suddenly retracted them into its sort of pencil-like tube as I snorkeled across the top. So I'm getting further north now, and I did take one deviation from the path to visit the tern colony at Long Nanny, and the volunteer rangers showed me through the telescope and pointed out the different types of terns, the Arctic terns, the sandwich terns, and of course the little terns that they protect on the beach there. And just a few days ago I watched James Porteous's talk, The Shorebirds of Long Nanny, and learned about the ups and downs of the success or otherwise of that little tern colony and how they're seeking to protect them from disturbance and potentially from sea level rise and climate change as well. So good luck to them. That evening I reached Sea Houses. The weather was taking a turn for the worst, and I succumbed to the welcoming charms of the old ship. And so rather than sleeping rough in Sea Houses, I paid for a bed for the night and had a very nice meal and a pint of beer there. And chilled out for a bit, just to prepare for the final leg of part one, which was up to Bamburgh and then to Belford, and caught the bus back down the A1 and home. So there's going up the hill from Bamburgh Castle to probably the golf course with the best view in the world of Budle Bay and Lindisfarne. I sat on a bench just past the golf course and just sort of paused for a moment and watched the gulls flying up and down, the water snaking through the rivulets on the beach, and a million sort of riffles glimmering like diamonds. And even though I've only been away from home for, for 4 nights, it really was a wonderful break and a restoring experience. And then I went home and, told Dorothy about my trip and showed her some photographs of the flowers, and she really appreciated that. So that was the summer of 2019. And some of you may remember something called coronavirus struck the following spring. Sadly, before then, Dorothy passed away. So I had quite a difficult 12 months. The loss of Dorothy, and then coronavirus and lockdown in the spring of 2020. And like many people, I struggled. And I think one of the things that kept me going was deciding that I was going to continue the walk and almost turn it into a pilgrimage, really, in memory of Dorothy and Mary. So in the summer of 2020, I caught the bus back up the A1 just after the COVID restrictions eased, and continued my walk from Belford. And here's a route map of my journey in part 2, down through the Cheviots to Bellingham and then to Haltwhistle. It might interest the birders amongst you to know that in part 1 I saw and identified 70 species of bird. Now I know that is a really small number. I've done bird races in the past and seen nearly 100 species in a day, but there were some pretty good birds amongst them, like puffin and little tern. So it was an eclectic bird list. Then I reflected on that at the end of part 2, and I only actually managed to add about 4 birds in part 2 to that list, and you'll see some of them as we progress. So here we are in Belford. There's a lovely church in Belford called St Mary's, and I lit a candle in there as a memorial to Dorothy and Mary. And I would just remember the sun shining through a beautiful stained glass window as I walked down the aisle to light those candles. That was a really beautiful and meaningful experience, and an important part of my journey. So leaving the church, I headed west, I think it's along St Cuthberts Way, because eventually I reached St Cuthberts Cave over up in that direction that you can see in the photo. Before I got to St Cuthberts Cave, I got a superb view of Lindisfarne from Wheatside Crag here. You can see the tractor in the foreground making the hay, gulls circling overhead. A bit further around the corner, I got to a bog, which I saw from the map was disused coal workings. And it's funny, isn't it, in the northeast, how often some of the best wildlife sites are sort of housed on the remnants of old industry. And I think that we blend our industrial past with the restoration in the future quite well in places. Anyway, on this particular bog, I disturbed a flock of lapwings that sort of all leapt up and sort of fanned skyward to lure me away from their eggs as I passed. They circled on saucer-shaped wings and made a sophisticated sky dance. What a beautiful bird, the peewit. And it has many other common and local names around Britain. I got to the top of the hill, a place called Green Sheen Hill, I just included this area because I'm not a geologist in any way, shape, or form, but this was one of the most beautiful rock formations that I saw on my entire walk. This sort of compressed and rippled effect that you can see there just above St. Cuthberts Cave. So I came down the other side of the hill. For the first time in my life, I visited St. Cuthberts Cave, and what an absolutely amazing spot. It reminded me, these boulders, of something out of Lord of the Hobbit, in fact, where the trolls got turned to stone by this sunlight. I have quite a vivid imagination when I'm walking, and like to link the landscapes to my favourite childhood books. From St. Cuthberts Cave, I continued west, taking the road to Wooler. I padded along miles of farm tracks with the view of the Cheviots sort of unfolding in front of me, startling hares at every bend. And I sort of got different types of wildlife in my mind now as I imagine parts of Northumberland, and this place on the way to Wooler I will always associate with hares. I probably saw 3 or 4 hares in the space of about 6 miles. I slept somewhere up on the hills before Wooler, and then descended into Wooler the next morning, and had a very welcome breakfast at the Terrace Cafe that I would thoroughly recommend. A very hospitable stopping off point before I embarked upon the journey up to the Cheviots, where I wouldn't really encounter civilization again for several days. So I started walking up into the foothills of the Cheviots, and the first interesting bird I saw was a curlew, a solitary curlew. In fact, it broke cover, and it called repeatedly and circled in laps over the moor. Its down-curved bill quivered like a bent tuning fork. It was a creamy ghost over the deep green spruce, and it was quite a sad sight actually, because the sound, that babbling sound, it was bouncing off the trees, and it was almost like the curlew was looking for a mate, and then it heard the noise, circled round, and then perhaps it was a bit disappointed because the noise was its own echo. And it actually reminded me of that song Puff the Magic Dragon. Further west, I reached Yeavering Bell, the wonderful twin peaks that used to have an Iron Age hill fort on them. I dropped my rucksack at the bottom of the hill and sort of legged it up the hill just to experience the wonderful sight at the top. And there was a storm clouds coming in over the coast. And that was the first time I've been to Yeavering Bell, and it was really quite a memorable part of the overall journey. And I spent quite some time trying to imagine I was an Iron Age dweller there, wondering, what they did, how they lived, and perhaps the battles they had between different hill forts in the area before the Romans came. Now, I'd heard about the College Valley, but I'd never been. And a friend of mine, Richard Clark, he recommended that I took this route to get from Wooler up to the Cheviot via the College Valley. He told me it was good for wildlife. And it was. Just as I turned the corner into the College Valley, I stumbled across this bird perched on a stand of bracken. At first I thought it was a stone chat, and then took a bit of a closer look and realized it was its sort of cousin, the wind chat, which, well, at least for me, is a rarer bird, because I've seen many stone chats and maybe 1 or 2 wind chats. It has a black and white striped head, as if it's wearing a bandana. So I think some of you know what I'm going to say I saw next as I headed up the College Valley. can hear a few hands, see a few hands going up at the back of the room. Yes, the wild goats. And there were 3 wild goats, like Billy Goat's Gruff, that I saw with their long shaggy hair, their fearsome horns. One was charcoal, and one was grey and white, and another was white and cream. So I think that was the first time I'd seen the wild goats of Northumberland. I've seen them up in Scotland on the islands, but never in Northumberland before. So I paid my toll to the troll to pass and continued up the valley to where I slept that night at the top of the valley just before Hen Hole. This was a really memorable night, having the top of the valley to myself. Really felt like I'd arrived, if you like, in one of the most remote spots of Northumberland. And Richard said to me, a good way up to the Cheviot is to continue up this rocky valley. And that's what I did the next morning. And isn't it quite different to most pictures of the Cheviots, which we generally associate with rolling hills and not many rocks? And this looks more like a picture of the Lake District, where the bedrock is exposed. You know, one of the few places you can see the exposed rock in Northumberland. And also interesting vegetation here. There was a spiky grass with broad serrated leaves, and sort of dried seed heads on top, which perhaps some kind of rush. And then I also saw these purple flowers, which I identified from my book as possibly wild thyme. So it was nice to see a bit of differentiation in the vegetation in that area. Perhaps it's because it was too steep for, you know, for the sheep to graze. As I approached the brow of the hill, I saw a pair of golden birds pottering around amongst the common grass, like wind-up automatons, guarding their nests with plaintive peeps. As I got closer, I saw they were breeding golden plover. Now, I'm familiar with seeing golden plover down at St Mary's Island, and I've never seen them in their breeding habitat with the black, you know, bib on their chest. That was a real treat, worth climbing up Hen Hole just to see those, and then getting the view at Orcote Cairn to the north, which is a famous view in the Cheviots. So from there, I climbed up to the summit of the Cheviot, with its famous whitewashed pillar trig point on a sort of whitewashed altar, and then walked west across miles of millstone slabs that were put down to protect the bog. I had Scotland to my north and England to the south, past Windy Gyle, and then eventually got that evening to the Lamb Hill Mountain Hut. The weather was turning then, and I actually slept in that hut that evening, which was quite a memorable experience. I was the only one in there. I noticed there was a little poster on the wall that told me a bit about some of the wildlife that I might see in the area. It said the area is rich with wildlife. Dipper was mentioned, oyster catcher, curlew, black grouse. Now I definitely didn't see a black grouse, buzzard, and windchat, red squirrel, brown hare, roe deer, and feral goat. So I'd seen some of those. You know, so I wasn't doing too badly in terms of what it said I might see. And then it said, and frequently is that, and the otter is making a welcome comeback. And an otter is something that I've only ever seen twice in Northumberland, once at Gosforth Nature Reserve and once at another lake in Northumberland, Big Waters, only twice. And I've been here for 25 years. So I was always on my journey, I was always on the lookout for otter. The following morning, I was woken up by a tapping at the window, and it was these flock of starlings. disturbed me very early that morning. So perhaps not particularly unusual wildlife, but there was certainly plenty of them. And then the next day I walked around the top of the Cheviots and eventually ended up that evening at Paddon Hill, which is a very obvious landmark a bit further south, north of Bellingham. And here I saw a bird that at first I thought was a swift on steroids, because it seemed quite sort of plump and muscly, being chased by two crows. It pulled back its wings and made a steep dive, at which point I realized it wasn't a swift at all, but it was a peregrine falcon. I saw it for a second and then it was gone, but I think just possibly it might nest on some cliffs near there. So I continue my journey south and sat down the next day on a stile just before Bellingham. Now, I actually didn't see any owls at all on my walk, which was perhaps surprising because, you know, I was up really early and walking often towards dusk. But I suspect that this little tiny group of bones and fur and stones I saw on the stile were the remains of an owl pellet. So I like to think perhaps it was a barn owl that had perched on the stile that evening. Okay, so I continued through Bellingham, through the Walk Forest, miles of dense forest, and eventually popped out on Hadrian's Wall and the Windsill at Caulfield Crags. And this was the last morning of my trip. On part 2, I saw quite a lot of wild flowers in the top of the wall, including this lady's bedstraw, which some friends on Twitter helped me to identify early today. So thank you very much for that. And went down to the car park there where the old quarry lake is and had my breakfast, and then descended down the hill to Haltwhistle and caught the bus home. So that was part 2. And came home, and then the rest of 2020, which of course didn't turn out terribly well because there was another lockdown over Christmas and the winter. It was a long dark winter. I remember celebrating the anniversary of Dorothy's passing one dark October evening and lighting a candle for her in the house with Tracy, my wife. And you know, and then 2021 things got going again, and I decided, well, I'd done 2/3 of a walk around Northumberland, and I was going to finish it off. So over that winter I spent quite a bit of time planning the last leg from Haltwhistle back to Blyth, and this turned out to be the longest leg by far, and I think I was out for 7 nights. And I've sort of nicknamed this Rivers and Railways. So I'm sort of building up a habitat map of Northumberland: coast, hills, rivers. And many of you will know that there's a rich industrial history in this area that I explored, as well as the wildlife. So I jumped off the train at Haltwhistle. Actually didn't arrive until afternoon that day, and walked up the South Tyne. Saw this heron fishing, and the first interesting place I got to was a wood called Ballister Estate that's owned by the National Trust, and they're absolutely full of flowers, this wood: foxgloves, harebells, or various types of orchids, which I'm pretty hopeless at identifying. But perhaps the standout flower was honeysuckle, because the woods just smell absolutely beautiful of honeysuckle. And I remembered thinking Dorothy would have absolutely loved a walk in those woods, seeing the wild honeysuckle. and the pink tinged valerian. And so I was only walking for a few miles that day and reached Featherstone Castle in the evening, which I'd never been to. And it was just like walking onto a film set. Majestic oaks cast long shadows over a honey-coloured castle, complete with gatehouse and keeper. I just imagined that a group of riders on horseback were going to ride out of that gatehouse, sort of round me up. There's a wonderful habitat here. It's really quite unlike anything else I've seen in Northumberland. I'm from Nottinghamshire originally, and it reminded me more of Sherwood Forest with these majestic oaks. I noticed on the Ordnance Survey map, there's one oak's given a name called the Diamond Oak here. I don't think that's it, but there really were some beautiful specimen trees, the likes of which I've not often seen in the northeast of England. There were other great things here as well. Perched on the gorse, I caught the orange flick of a bird's tail feathers. Was it a stonechat, a flycatcher? I looked again, it was a redstart. I was pretty chuffed about that. Not seen many redstarts in my life. There were more oyster catchers, and I slept there that evening on the banks of the river, and every hour the flock of oyster catchers seemed to do a patrol over the riverbank like an overzealous cuckoo clock. I was pretty exhausted the following morning. It was lovely to see the wildlife, but I didn't get much sleep. That's where I slept. But I did have a bit of a shock the next morning. And this is the scene that I woke up to. My whole tent was completely surrounded by cows. I hadn't noticed them the previous evening. And I really, really panicked. What should I do? Should I stay there and freeze? I thought about running into the river or standing up and trying to chase them off. What would you do in that situation? Well, what I actually did was I just lay there rigid with fear, and did absolutely nothing. After about 20 minutes, which must have been the longest 20 minutes of my life, they eventually moved off and I lived to tell the tale. So I packed up and set off south towards Alston, up the South Tyne Railway. And at some point I passed the border between Northumberland and, as it says, Cumberland, the part of the old county of Cumbria. I arrived in Alston and sort of had some refreshments there before moving on up to the North Pennines. And there was a big sign when I got to the North Pennines welcoming me to the moor and telling me about all the wildlife that I might see, such as black grouse and golden plover, lapwing, merlin, red grouse and ring ouzel. In actuality, this was one of the most depressing parts of my entire walk from a wildlife perspective. There were just miles of pretty monotonous grassland, and there were hundreds of traps for stoats and weasels. Pretty much the area was silent. There was almost nothing there whatsoever. And then the reason why I was going that way up to Cross Fell was because I wanted to go to a waterfall that is rarely visited, which was a highlight of this section of the walk, in fact, called Cache Falls. And I was delighted when I found it because I could actually see the columnar rock of the wind sill exposed. And then sort of that linked me back to other parts of my walk where I'd seen the same wind sill at Dunfell Castle and, of course, Hadrian's Wall. There was a lovely plunge pool here that I went for a quick dip in. and I was refreshed before I continued my journey up to the top of Crossfell, and saw I'd never been to Crossfell before, and saw the large shelter, if you like, in the shape of a cross. So from here, I continued my journey and got great views of the Cowgreen Reservoir from the top of the ridge. And just a few days ago, no, not just a little while ago, sorry, I watched this talk about the botany of the area by John O'Reilly, and he told us about Dr. Margaret Bradshaw, who studied the flowers and plants of the Upper Tees Valley for many, many years, and told us how when the Cowgreen Reservoir was constructed in the 1960s to supply water to Teesside, a lot of that nutrient poor grassland was drowned, which was home to rare alpine plants such as the electric blue spring gentian. Now, I didn't see the spring gentian, but I did very much enjoy my walk down the Upper Tees Valley. There was this wonderful area that looked like a mini canyon, and the banks were carpeted with tiny purple and white flowers, possibly wild thyme again. So here I am. I visited the top of Great Dunfell, where the radar station is, and then headed east, looping round, and slept that night at the headwaters of the South Tyne. There's a bit of a gap in my walk here because I actually got ill. I got quite sick. I don't know why. It was possibly because I was eating the silica gel packs in my dried meals, because I thought there was salt and pepper. So the silica gel possibly didn't do me much good, or it's possible that I got some sort of like dodgy water from the stream. But anyway, I had to stumble the next morning down the hill to Gowergill, and Tracy very kindly came to rescue me. I was at home for about 48 hours before I caught the bus back to Alston and continued my journey. So sort of slightly backtracking here, because I'm back in Alston again, and now I'm heading basically due east for Blanchland across the moors back into Northumberland. But it was probably not completely wasted journey, because I discovered the River Nent. Now, apparently the River Nent, according to the Environment Agency, is the second most metal polluted river in England, with very high concentrations of cadmium, lead and zinc. I didn't drink from this river, fortunately, but it was home to some fantastic plants and animals. The mountain pansy was evident there, as well as the banded damozel dragonfly. So it was actually a real highlight of my walk, the River Nent, and I'd thoroughly recommend anybody exploring that area. At the top of the River Nent, at Nent Head, I discovered the entrance to one of the old mines that, you know, would be responsible for that metal pollution in the river. I pressed my nose to the iron gate and was enveloped by a cold, dark, metallic breeze, and I thought about the history and times of the miners that used to go down those tunnels. And coincidentally, just next to there was another superstar miner, but of an avian nature, because there was a colony of sand martins nesting in the banks of some of the headwaters of the River Nent. And I watched them zipping into their burrows. Okay, so I continued up the hill from the River Nent, and I got into my head that it'd be a really good thing to find the county tri-point between Northumberland, Cumbria and Durham. And I did, on a very boggy moor called Kilhope Moor. And that monumental part of our landscape is marked with a small collection of about 12 small boulders. So I got there and I felt ridiculously excited and happy that I found the county tri-point, despite the lack of, if you like, landscape features. Continued across Kilhope Law. Massive peat hags looming every dozen metres, but was pleasantly pleased to see that some areas have been dammed to reduce the runoff and the degradation of the peat, and obviously the subsequent release of the carbon. There was some wildlife up here actually, and quite a rare plant, cloudberries dotting the bog. I didn't eat any because at that point I didn't know what they were, and I didn't know they were edible, but perhaps if I go back I'll try one or two. That evening I slept on a really atmospheric spot, Green Hill above Allen Heads. I was getting slightly better at pitching my bivvy and tarpaulin by that point, slightly more accomplished than I was back in 2019 on the coast. I'd actually upgraded my bivvy bag to a hooped bivvy bag, which meant that it didn't sort of rest on my face while I was sleeping. I continued east across Ted and Moss, passing the huts here, which are used for grouse shooting. Sorry. There was evidence of sort of more works for the grouse moors, a little digger there. And one of the sort of less pleasant aspects of my walk was this whole area was full of rabbits and dead rabbits. I won't leave that picture up for too long, but I did actually meet a local person in Allen Heads, and they told me that you know, any predators in that area are persecuted by the gamekeepers. And if you put two and two together, why are there all of those rabbits, and why are the rabbits not eaten by anything when they die? It's because the top of the pyramid, you know, has been chopped off, and so there's nothing to kill the rabbits and there's nothing to eat them when they die. It's really quite a depressing landscape from my point of view. You don't have to go far away from the moors though until you're back in, you know, something resembling normality. And I got to the headwaters of the River Derwent, a place called Blaydon Burn, and I almost immediately saw some red kites in that area, which was a real treat. And as you'll know, many of you'll know, the red kites were released into the Derwent Valley, you know, a few decades ago, and they've spread possibly up to this point. It's a shame they can't get any further west onto the grouse moors. I walked down the hill and had a swim in the headwaters of the River Derwent, and sort of relaxed and allowed a bit of the, you know, the grime from the trip to wash off. The next notable place I reached is the picture postcard village of Blanchland, and stopped for a very welcome rest there and a very nice coffee in one of the cafes. Followed the River Derwent downstream until I got to the Derwent Reservoir. I bumped into a bird watcher from Sunderland. He told me that ospreys are occasionally seen here. Unfortunately, I didn't see any ospreys, but I did see hundreds of grey-lag geese swimming around and flying around the area. I saw another mammal on my trip. Some of you may be able to guess what that mammal is. At Pow Hill Country Park, the red squirrel, which was quite a surprise. I've seen red squirrels up at Wallington many times in Northumberland, but I didn't know that they were seen so far south. And they did appear quite tame. I suspect people feed them. Obviously I didn't, but one of them leapt up onto my walking poles and was clearly hunting around for nuts. This photograph really was one of the most remarkable views I had on my entire journey around Northumberland. Muggleswick Common, looking east down to Newcastle, maybe about 20 miles. Really one of the most surprising views of Newcastle I've ever had in my life, across the purple patches of heather and between the stone shooting butts on the common there. It's sort of like linked town and country. You know, I spend my life in Newcastle and I never knew that you could see it from such a distance in such a different habitat and such a different landscape. If you've never been to Muggleswick Common, I'd really recommend it. It's a fascinating place just beyond the Derwent Reservoir. So really the remainder of my trip then was following the view you can see on this slide, following the zigzag of the River Derwent down below Consett through Shotley Bridge, eventually snaking all the way down to the River Tyne and to Newcastle. So really it's there all laid out before us. Obviously, as I journeyed down the river, it grew in size and power. And here I saw my first dipper of the trip, bobbing up and down on a rock that bisected the torrent, chestnut brown and round like a conker with a snowy white bib. I didn't actually take that photograph there because I just had a tiny compact camera with me, but it's sort of a library photograph of a dipper I took on the Ouseburn in Newcastle. So that sort of brought home, you know, the sort of habitat that I was in, dipper habitat, fast flowing waters of the River Derwent. And apparently an old name, local name for the River Derwent was Smiling Water or Laughing Water, which I thought was rather lovely. So I carried on down the river to more familiar territory for myself and my wife, because we often go for walks in the Derwent Valley Country Park. And this is one of our favourite places, Owlet Hill, where there's a large meander of the river that snakes under the railway line. And I thought that this was probably the best chance I had on my entire trip of seeing an otter, because I was there in the evening. I sat and ate my dinner, the shadows lengthened, and I tuned into every splosh and splash, imagining a squirm of otters slithering over one of the rocks in the river. But sadly, even though I waited there for several hours, I didn't see one. So I dipped the otter in birding speak. That evening I slept near Hollinside Manor in the Derwent Park, and great habitat here actually. I often go there during the day but never at night, so there were bats above, and when I woke up very early the following morning, I was making my day down through the woodland and heard a rustling in the bushes. I thought it was perhaps a blackbird making that leaf rustling noise. I just crept slowly into the wood and I saw a big lump of grey, striped grey, scuffling off, and lo and behold, it was a badger, which was really exciting to see. Very rarely seen badgers before, so to find my own badger, if you like, without being shown one or where it was a real treat. I descended down early that morning into the Derwent Valley Country Park and got back to the river, and I noticed some movement, and it was a small roe deer midstream, head down, drinking in the water. And when it noticed me, it trotted off, but it didn't jump to the riverbank. It carried on actually walking up the river, showing its white rump. That was a hot day, and it got hotter and hotter and hotter. It was I think it was probably the hottest day of this year, 2021. At 7 a.m. I reached the confluence of the Derwent and the Tyne and paused to say farewell to my friend that had been with me, the Derwent, for the last few days. It sluggishly flowed into the Tyne under a low railway bridge. Pigeons preened on the ledge, and a tern, spelt wrong, sorry, circled over the staithes. And the tern reminded me then, it sort of began to link me back to sort of part one of my walk and the journey up the coast. So I headed down through the quayside, down on the Gateshead side, passed under the 7 bridges, and of course stopped to listen to the famous kittiwakes nesting under the Tyne Bridge on those granite towers. And everybody will know, listening to this talk, the furthest inland breeding colony of kittiwakes in the country. So headed east down the Wallsend cycleway. By this time in the day, it was about 30 degrees, I think, and there wasn't much wildlife calling or birds singing. I think everything was pretty much given up for the day. But I did see quite a lot of activity when I eventually reached the beach in Tynemouth. The beaches were covered with people. It was like being on the south coast of Spain that evening. So this sort of shocked me back into cosmopolitan life as I walked up through Whitley Bay, and eventually that evening arrived at St Mary's Lighthouse. And a rather nice end to my journey. That evening I saw another pod of dolphins heading south. You just see the wind turbines there behind them. So again, that sort of like linked the first part of my walk with the third part of my walk as I circled round Northumberland and came back to the coast. So the final morning I was treated to a superb sunrise at the lighthouse, headed north the last few miles past Seaton Sluice, past the multicoloured beach huts at Blyth, and back to Blyth Jetty, where 2 years later I arrived back at that sculpture, Spirit of the Staithes, by Simon Packard. And I bumped into a chap in Blyth just before this point, and he told me that his father used to work here as a foreman for British Coal, supervising the unloading of the coal from the wagons onto the boats. And he told me if I stood back from this sculpture, the metal panels on the top would form themselves into the shape of a train. I hadn't realized this 2 years ago. So I backed up the road, and lo and behold, the train appeared with its coal wagon. And to me, that became a metaphor really for my walk, because circling round the county where I've lived for the last 25 years, walking it step by step, allowed my understanding and my mental map of Northumberland to form into place, just like those metal panels formed into the shape of the coal wagon. So that's it. The question: if you walked 260 miles around the perimeter of Northumberland in July without straying too far from the path, what wildlife would you hope to see? Well, I've given you my experience. So the landscape, the coast, hills and rivers, I saw just 8 mammals, probably the most exciting of which was the dolphin. I saw 76 species of bird, the most exciting of which was probably the puffin. So many plants, which I won't list, but of different habitat types: coastal, woodland and alpine. Saw a variety of insects, butterflies, midges, crickets, and the damselfly. And you might ask at the back, what would you like to have seen that you didn't see? Well, otter would have been top of my list, osprey, adder. I saw signs for adder, but I never actually saw one. Fox would have been nice. Hen harrier would have been even better. And maybe if I did this walk again in another 10 years' time, I might see pine marten and beaver. That would be a real treat. So, just a reminder of the route, in case any of you fancy following in my footsteps and completing the, if you like, the round Northumberland walk. And if I was here with you in person, I'd ask for questions, which unfortunately I can't do. But if you do watch this talk and if you've enjoyed it, feel free to drop me a line on Twitter at Marek Bidwell. Ask me any questions you like and I'll do my best to respond. So thank you very much for having me. I look forward to when we can meet again in person.